Bertrand Russell's The Problems of Philosophy, Part 5. We move into Chapter 12 here, which is entitled Truth and Falsehood. And here we find that, like the universalist, loving Platonist that Russell is, he's not really concerned with what beliefs are true or false. Instead, he seems to want to get to that core question, what is truth and what is falsehood? And so he gives us here three basic criteria for discovering the nature of truth. First, a theory of truth must admit of an opposite, right? So just as we saw with Heraclitus, the idea that everything has its basic opposite, any theory of truth must admit of an opposite. So if there is a truth, then there must be a false as well. Secondly, truth and falsehood must be seen as properties of beliefs and statements. And so truth and falsehood, when we come to understand them, is going to be an association with a basic statement of fact. And so if I say that, Russell's Problems of Philosophy is 800 pages long, then I can look at it and I can see that no, it's only about 150 or so pages. And so I know that statement to be false. Thirdly, truth and falsehood depends upon something which lies outside of the belief. So essentially, truth consists in some form of correspondence that exists between belief and between fact. So somewhere between our belief and the statement of fact that we're calling true or false, this is where this notion is going to reside. And so there is a correspondence there. He goes on to talk about the idea of a coherence theory. And he says that the coherence theory has been advanced by many different philosophers. But Russell is going to point out what he sees to be the problems with it. He writes, "There is, however, a great difficulty in this view, or rather two great difficulties. The first is that there is no reason to suppose that only one coherent body of beliefs is possible. It may be that with sufficient imagination, a novelist might invent a past for the world that would be perfectly fit onto what we know, and yet be quite different from the real past. In more scientific matters, it is certain that there are often two or more hypotheses which account for all the known facts on the subject, and although, in such cases, men of science endeavor to find facts which will rule out the hypotheses except one, there is no reason why they should always succeed." And so basically he sees that there is a difficulty with this idea of coherence for the simple reason that there could be multiple options that are open, multiple possibilities that are available to us. We recognize, of course, that the world we're living in is a particular way, and we understand that there is a history behind this world that goes back for thousands of years. But let's suppose that this were not actually the case. Let's suppose that there were some author who had concocted a fantasy, a fiction about what the universe is, that it is, very different from what it actually is, but yet somehow they were able to feed that into us and get us to believe it. We would have a coherent view based upon a falsehood. Okay? Very similar to the evil deceiver in Descartes. But it seems that there needs to be some kind of cohesion, there needs to be some kind of coherence that comes into play. But why couldn't we invent a past for the world? Why couldn't this past fit in with what we know, but yet be different from the real past? And if that were the case, why is it that we would prefer one view over the other? Wouldn't the coherence be able to apply equally to either one? Well, he goes on and gives a rather drawn-out explanation in which he raises a further cloud of dust. And then he says, A belief is true when it corresponds to a certain associated complex, and false when it does not. So he ends up giving us a very simplistic definition of truth. A thing is true, a belief is true, if it corresponds to a certain associated complex, and false when it does not. In other words, if a belief corresponds to a fact, then it's true. If it doesn't, then it's false. Now, in most cases, this is quite simple. If I make the claim that Austin wrote Emma, then my statement is true. And you can see right on the screen there that there is the book with the author's name associated to it. And so there we have a true statement. If, on the other hand, I make the claim that Dickens wrote Emma, then my statement is false because it doesn't correspond with the facts of the world. However, it is more complex when it comes to beliefs as opposed to facts, because the mind doesn't create the idea of true or false. The mind creates beliefs. So suppose instead of coming out and saying Dickens wrote Emma, I make the statement, I believe that Dickens wrote Emma. Now, even though Dickens did not write Emma, if I genuinely believe that he did, then the statement is true with regards to the belief, even though I am mistaken about my belief. My belief that Dickens wrote Emma doesn't correspond to the world that we live in. I hold a false belief. But if the statement is not about the fact in the world, but about my belief, then it could be said that my belief is false, even though it's true that I believe it. Moving on to chapter 13, we find knowledge, error, and probable opinion. So Russell argues here that defining knowledge as true belief, which is what he was doing in the last section, is insufficient. Because as we saw, we could believe something that is true, but for the wrong reasons. And this would be true belief, but not true knowledge. So for example, I may believe that Hamlet was written by someone whose last name began with an S. Okay? Hamlet was written by someone whose last name begins with an S. Now this belief is true. But suppose that in my mind I thought that Hamlet was written by Steinbeck instead of Shakespeare. Well, then that would not be knowledge, because I would effectively be wrong, right? Because Hamlet was written by Shakespeare, not Steinbeck. But in thinking that it was written by Steinbeck, I'm still correct in my claim, in my belief, that Hamlet was written by somebody whose name begins with S. So to help overcome this problem, Russell is going to distinguish between intuitive knowledge, which we learned about in a previous chapter, and derivative knowledge. So derivative knowledge, he says, is validly deduced from premises that are known intuitively. In derivative knowledge, our ultimate premises must have some degree of self-evidence, and so must their connection with the conclusions deduced from them. Take, for example, a piece of reasoning in geometry. It is not enough that the axioms from which we start should be self-evident. It is necessary also that at each step in the reasoning, the connection of premises and conclusions should be self-evident. In difficult reasoning, this connection has often only a very small degree of self-evidence, hence errors of reasoning are not improbable, where the difficulty is great. So if I reason that in a right triangle, x equals 45 degrees, then I'm basing that knowledge upon the axiom that all triangles add up to 180 degrees. I also have the knowledge that in a right triangle, that the initial right angle is 90 degrees. And so if I know that one is 90 degrees, the other is 45, and it has to add up to 180, then I know that the other angle, angle x, is going to be 45 degrees. And so with simplistic concepts like that, he says, we have no problem. But for more difficult equations, there is going to be room for error. He goes on to say here, what we firmly believe, if it is true, is called knowledge, provided it is either intuitive or inferred from intuitive knowledge, from which it follows logically. What we firmly believe, if it is not true, is called error. What we firmly believe, if it is neither knowledge nor error, and also what we believe hesitatingly, because it is or is derived from something which is not the highest degree of self-evidence, may be called probable opinion. Thus, the greater part of what would commonly pass as knowledge is more or less probable opinion. So the basics of what we get from this chapter are very simple. First, what we firmly believe, if it is true, is going to be called knowledge, as long as that is either intuitive or inferred from intuitive knowledge. So if we firmly believe something, if that belief is actually true, then that is knowledge. Now, what we firmly believe, if it's not true, is called error. So, for example, when we talked previously in this course about the belief in the Middle Ages that the Earth was the center of the universe, the sun, the moon, the stars all circled around the Earth. Well, the people at the time firmly believed that because based upon empirical evidence, it made complete sense. It doesn't feel like we're moving, we're standing still. We look up in the sky and we see the sun arc across the sky as if it's traveling around us. So I mean, the evidence seems to point to that. And so we firmly believed it. But we learn, of course, later on that this was not true. And so what this is an error. And finally, what we firmly believe, if it is not either knowledge or error, is what we're going to call probable opinion. And this is really the bulk of all of our knowledge, is that most of what we know is in some way simply probable knowledge. There's a good likelihood that it's true, when in reality we don't know that 100%, we don't know that for sure. Another term that gets used for it is warranted assertability. When it comes to a claim of truth, do I have enough evidence? Is it coherent to my belief set? In which case I can call it warranted assertability, that I have the claim that what I know is acceptable enough to be used. And so that's what the bulk of our knowledge ultimately entails. Moving on to chapter 14, he talks about the limits of philosophical knowledge. And he begins this way. In all that we have said hitherto concerning philosophy, we have scarcely touched on many matters that occupy a great space in the writings of most philosophers. Most philosophers, or at any rate very many, profess to be able to prove by a priori metaphysical reasoning such things as the fundamental dogmas of religion, the essential rationality of the universe, the illusoriness of matter, the unreality of all evil, and so on. There can be no doubt that the hope of finding reason to believe such theses as these has been the chief inspiration of many lifelong students of philosophy. This hope, I believe, is vain. It would seem that knowledge concerning the universe as a whole is not to be obtained by metaphysics, and that the proposed proof that in virtue of the laws of logic such and such things must exist and such others cannot, are not capable of surviving a critical scrutiny. Well, as you hopefully recall from the introduction to Russell, he is one of the fathers of analytic philosophy. And here we see him promoting that position, challenging certainly the continental view, but I would argue he's challenging a lot of the history of philosophy itself along with it. Philosophy has traditionally sought the absolute to try to demonstrate how the universe works on a grand scale. It wants to answer the big questions of life. But Russell feels that this project is futile. Instead, he wants to analyze the minutiae without any real care for the big pictures. Essentially, we can see him in very strong disagreement with people such as Boethius, who taught that we should seek the whole rather than the parts. Russell looks to the parts at the expense of the whole. The little cartoon on the screen, I think, is very telling in terms of this, right? He says, I think we need to draw a distinction between drawing a distinction and painting a distinction. This is the type of thing that Russell would have been involved in. The analytic philosopher simply wants to analyze these concepts largely in a linguistic fashion to discover every minute point that we possibly can about some tiny minor thing, and is not really interested in getting to the overarching view, not really intending to get to the big picture. And so in this way, Russell's view really is very much in contradiction with a lot of the history of philosophy. He also is in disagreement, as he points out in this chapter, with the views of Hegel and Kant. And so just using Hegel as our example, we've talked about him before, but you remember the basic idea that Hegel puts forward, which is simply that we have our initial view, which is the thesis, and that view is going to later be challenged by an alternative perspective, namely an antithesis. And so these two will come into clash with each other, will form an Aufhebung, a synthesis of those two, which will bring us to a new perspective that becomes the new thesis. Eventually, that will get challenged by an alternative view, the antithesis. We'll need to form a future Aufhebung to get us closer to that reality, always moving forward on this progress until eventually we reach the point of absolute vision, of the absolute truth, the ultimate reality. And that was Hegel's vision. Once we reach the absolute, we can describe reality. All of the earlier ideas on the dialectic are merely partial. We get, this is a truth that works in this moment, but now it's been challenged. Here's a truth that works in this moment, but now it's been challenged. But only at the final stage of this, only at that point of absolute vision, are we going to be able to say that we simultaneously survey the whole. This is the point where we see it all. This is the point where we have that absolute knowledge, that absolute truth, that link to absolute reality that has been the ongoing search of philosophy. And this is what Hegel was attempting to do. This is what many philosophers wanted to do, was to reach that absolute knowledge, that absolute truth. But Russell sees equivocation in Hegel's use of the term the nature of things. He says that Hegel uses nature of things both to mean all of the truths of something as well as to mean the thing itself. And so to help us understand this, Russell uses the example of a toothache. He says a person has a toothache. He knows it by acquaintance since he's able to feel the toothache, right? That person is in agony. He feels that pain. He understands it through those painful sensations. Now, because of this, the man is going to go to the dentist. And this dentist, because he's gone through schooling, he's gone through study, he has knowledge of the toothache. The dentist knows the truth of the toothache, the scientific understanding of it, what it is, what causes it, how to deal with it, and so on. But he doesn't know it by acquaintance because he's not feeling that sensation himself. The man with the toothache knows it by acquaintance, but he doesn't have all the truths about it. So Russell's point is that there are two different ways of knowing, and that these two different ways really cannot be allowed to be conflated. Now from this, Russell is going to go on to argue that we cannot prove that the universe as a whole forms a single harmonious system like Hegel believes that it does. We have no way of knowing for sure that this absolute vision is even out there, that this ultimate truth exists. We like to believe that it does, but there's no reason, or no proof, I should say, that the universe as a whole exists in that fashion, that it is a harmonious system. And so the criticism that Russell makes of Hegel, as well as of Kant and many others, comes down to the idea that we should take a scientific approach of examining the parts and building towards knowledge in this piecemeal fashion, rather than in the traditional approach of starting with a view to prove and then constructing a system to prove it. Russell believes that his approach is going to put philosophy on par with science. Now, of course, I would argue that if we put philosophy on par with science, then that would mean that it's constantly changing, it's constantly evolving its set of beliefs based solely upon induction, because that's all science is, really, is making a best guess based upon the evidence that we have at hand. So if that's what he wants to see philosophy as, then I guess that's okay. He says near the end of this chapter, philosophical knowledge, if what has been said above is true, does not differ essentially from scientific knowledge. The essential characteristic of philosophy, which makes it a study distinct from science, is criticism. It examines critically the principles employed in science and in daily life. It searches out any inconsistencies there may be with these principles, and it only accepts them when, as the result of critical inquiry, no reason for rejecting them has appeared. The criticism aimed at, in a word, is not that which without reason determines to reject, but that which considers a piece of apparent knowledge on its merits and retains whatever still appears to be knowledge when this consideration is completed. That some risk of error remains must be admitted, since human beings are fallible. Philosophy may claim justly that it diminishes the risk of error, and that in some cases it renders the risk so small as to be practically negligible. To do more than this is not possible in a world where mistakes must occur, and more than this no prudent advocate of philosophy would aim to have performed. And so in essence, this chapter 14, The Limits of Knowledge, is largely constructing an argument for why his analytic approach is the one that we should ultimately be following, that we should be aiming towards that sense of analyzing the minutiae, because what makes philosophy unique from any other science is simply this idea of criticism. Can we analyze and consider the words that we are using, the way that we are coming to know this understanding? Can we discover everything we can about this little piece of the world, and then begin to build up from there? That's what he wants to see happen, and that's what he's promoting here. And so we finally come to the last chapter, chapter 15, the value of philosophy. And in this final chapter, Russell is going to raise the question of the value of philosophy, and he notes that there's a lot of people that find philosophy essentially to be worthless. But he says those people tend to only consider the material world. They concern themselves with the mundane aspects of existence. How much money can I make? How big of a house can I get? How big of a car can I get? What's for dinner tonight? Right? These people are concerned with the ordinary, the mundane aspect of existence, and they miss out on the fact that there is a lot more to this world than just that material aspect. These people are only concerned with feeding their body, not their minds. And so he says philosophy does have value. Like other sciences, like other disciplines, it primarily aims at knowledge. Philosophy is the starting point of that knowledge. All the sciences, astronomy, physics, chemistry, psychology, all of the sciences began originally as philosophy. People complain that philosophy never finds definitive answers, that all it does is to circle around and raise questions without being able to answer them. But Russell points out that philosophy does actually find definite answers in many areas. But when this happens, a new branch of science is created to deal with those types of questions and answers. And so philosophy is that theoretical starting point that leads to the creation of the science once there are some answers within it. And that's what its ultimate value or purpose becomes. Beyond this point, philosophy delves into questions that are of the greatest concern to us, but yet lack definite answers. Is there a purpose or a plan to our life? Is consciousness eternal or is it finite? Do moral principles exist beyond humanity? You know, these types of questions are being raised and have always been raised within the realm of philosophy. These are questions that really matter to us, but yet they are questions that don't seem to have a definitive answer. Thinkers give responses to these questions, but the answers are not demonstratively true. So this leads to what I consider really to be the most useful aspect of philosophy, and probably the most profound thing that Bertrand Russell ever said. In philosophy, the questions are more important than the answers. Right? The questions are more important than the answers, because the questions tell us something about ourselves as individuals, as a community, as humanity in general. They tell us about who we are. They tell us about what is important to us. And it keeps alive the idea of striving for something that is beyond the mundane, something that's beyond the everyday. These questions propel us towards a higher way of thinking. They propel us towards our desire to expand our view of the universe. In essence, philosophy is what makes us human. And it's how we understand ourselves as humans. So the questions themselves are what is important, because it reminds us that, just like we learned with the existentialists, we are the only species that ponders our existence. We are the only species that wonders if there's a meaning to life, if there's anything beyond this world. We are the only species that raises these questions. And we know that there are some questions that have been with us throughout the entire scope of human history. And there are other questions that are only relevant for a brief period of history. And that tells us what is important to us at any given time, what is ultimately of value to us, what is it that we ultimately seek to find out of this world. And so really philosophy is that which makes us human. It's how we understand ourselves as humans. It's how we come to know ourselves as human. And so as we bring this lecture series to a close, I'm going to let Russell have the final word. Thus, to sum up our discussion of the value of philosophy, philosophy is to be studied not for the sake of any definite answers to its questions, since no definite answers can, as a rule, be known to be true, but rather for the sake of the questions themselves, because these questions enlarge our conception of what is possible, enrich our intellectual imagination, and diminish the dogmatic assurance, which closes the mind against speculation. But above all, because through the greatness of the universe, which philosophy contemplates, the mind also is rendered great and becomes capable of that union with the universe which constitutes its highest good. And that concludes Russell's The Problems of Philosophy.